Canada's Deadliest Prison Uprising. Subscribe for more real crime stories. Like, share, and join the discussion below. On April 14, 1971, Kingston Penitentiary in Ontario, Canada, erupted into chaos. The prison, notorious for its overcrowding and harsh conditions, became the stage for a violent inmate uprising. It began when Billy Knight, a prison barber, launched a well-coordinated attack on the guards. Within moments, 6 officers were taken hostage. The inmates seized control of the facility, holding the institution and its staff at their mercy. The demands were clear: better living conditions, an end to systemic mistreatment, and recognition of their humanity. As the standoff continued, tensions escalated, and the world watched in disbelief. But amidst the turmoil, a darker chapter was unfolding. On the final night of the riot, a group of inmates dragged undesirables, those convicted of sex offenses and informants, from their cells. They were bound and forced to kneel in a circle. In a brutal display, the prisoners began a savage assault on them, culminating in the deaths of 2 men. The scene was described as horrifying, with one witness recalling, "They looked like they were all dead, and the floor was full of blood." The violence was so intense that it left lasting psychological scars on those who witnessed it. The Canadian Armed Forces were eventually called in to restore order, but the damage was done. The riot had exposed the deep-seated issues within the Canadian prison system, issues that would take years to address. As the dust settled, the nation was left grappling with the aftermath. The events of that night would forever change the course of Canadian corrections. But the story doesn't end there. The repercussions of the uprising would ripple through the justice system, leading to trials, reforms, and a legacy that still resonates today. What happens? Ed Next would reveal the true cost of the riot and the lengths some would go to in its aftermath. When the sun rose over Kingston Penitentiary the next morning, the air still smelled of smoke and fear. Guards stood outside the gates, pale and shaken, while armored vehicles lined the prison walls. Inside, chaos reigned. Inmates roamed freely through the ruined corridors, some nursing wounds, others brandishing makeshift weapons fashioned from broom handles and broken pipes. The once-ordered structure of the penitentiary had collapsed overnight into a battlefield of survival and desperation. Negotiations began almost immediately. A small group of prisoners, calling themselves the Inmate Committee, tried to bring order to the madness. Their leader, a calm but intense man named Barry Mackenzie, acted as a spokesman. He insisted that the uprising wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity. The prisoners demanded humane treatment, better medical care, and protection from abusive guards. For the first time in years, they had the country's attention. From the outside, government officials hesitated. Ottawa was flooded with phone calls from reporters, politicians, and families of both inmates and hostages. Every decision felt like a gamble. The Canadian public was glued to their televisions, watching live coverage of the standoff that had transformed one of the nation's oldest prisons into a war zone. Inside, the atmosphere grew more volatile by the hour. While some prisoners wanted peaceful negotiation, others saw the chaos as an opportunity for vengeance. Factions formed. Some wanted to protect the hostages. Others wanted to use them as leverage. The cell blocks echoed with arguments, shouting, and the pounding of fists against steel doors. The tension was unbearable. By the 3rd day, conditions had worsened. Food supplies were nearly gone. The water system had failed. And the hostages were exhausted. The Inmate Committee managed to convince the rioters to let a group of journalists enter the prison, a move meant to show the world their side of the story. Cameras captured the eerie scenes of destruction: burned mattresses, broken furniture, graffiti scrawled across the walls reading, "We want justice." The footage shocked the nation. But just as negotiations seemed to be working, a new rumor spread like wildfire among the inmates: that the government had no intention of listening, that the army was preparing to storm the prison. Panic turned into fury. In an instant, the fragile peace crumbled. Fires were set in the cell blocks once again, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the corridors. Outside, Military units were given the order to prepare for entry. Helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the prisoners braced for a fight they couldn't win. The hostages huddled in fear as the final act of the uprising began to unfold. And then, without warning, a single gunshot rang out across the yard. What followed next would seal Kingston Penitentiary's place in Canadian history forever. The gunshot tore through the tense silence like a lightning bolt. For a split second, everything froze. Then the chaos erupted all over again. Soldiers and tactical officers surged toward the gates, and within minutes, Kingston Penitentiary became a storm of shouting, smoke, and confusion. The hostages were dragged to safety, one by one, as flashbangs and tear gas filled the air. Inmates screamed, some surrendering, others trying to hide behind barricades made of overturned bunks and broken doors. The uprising that began with demands for justice had spiraled into total collapse. When the military finally secured the compound, the scale of destruction was staggering. Fires smoldered in the corridors, windows were shattered, the chapel and hospital wing were reduced to ruins. 2 inmates lay dead, victims of the mob's wrath during the earlier chaos, and dozens more were injured. The surviving hostages stumbled out, pale and trembling, after 4 days trapped in a living nightmare. The riot was over, but the scars it left behind would last for decades. In the weeks that followed, investigators poured through the wreckage, trying to piece together what had really happened. The truth was complicated. Many inmates claimed the riot was sparked by desperation, fueled by overcrowding, abuse, and hopelessness. Guards testified about the fear and confusion that spread when order broke down. And while some prisoners were hailed for protecting the hostages, others faced murder charges for the deaths that occurred inside. Public opinion was divided. Some Canadians called for harsher punishment, believing the uprising proved that prisoners couldn't be reformed. Others saw it as a cry for help, a brutal reminder of a system that had long ignored its own failings. The government launched a formal inquiry, and its findings were damning. Conditions at Kingston were inhumane. Medical neglect, solitary confinement, and corruption had created a powder keg waiting to explode. The uprising ultimately forced change. By 1972, new oversight systems were introduced, and Canada's correctional services began slow but significant reforms. Kingston Penitentiary itself would operate for decades more before finally closing in 2013. Its stone walls still haunted by the memory of those 4 terrifying days in April 1971. To this day, the Kingston riot remains one of the darkest and most defining moments in Canadian prison history, a story of rebellion, desperation, and the high price of forgotten humanity.